We'll welcome everybody on YouTube, and I will switch you as the presenter. And we can see your screen now. Mike, you want to give us an introduction and go ahead and get started?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and dive in. Actually, Eric, can you mute? Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Though obviously unmute to ask any questions as we go. So thanks everybody for coming out tonight. And I don't know if anybody's tuning in on YouTube land, but thank you guys for coming as well. This is exploring the SQL PowerShell module. This is a presentation I've done around the SQL community to kind of show them the capabilities of PowerShell and SQL Server together, particularly with the module that comes with SQL Server. Eric's already talked a little bit about some of this, but here's if I can get my slides to respond. There we go. The obligatory bio slide. My name is Mike Fall. I'm a SQL Server DBA. I've been doing it for, gosh, since I think '99. So quite a while. Currently, I'm a consultant with a small boutique firm called UpSearch. We do just SQL Server consulting, all sorts of stuff. Some bits about me. I primarily blog and talk about SQL Server and PowerShell together. You guys already, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted tonight because you guys are, it's a PowerShell group. So you guys already know the wonders and the strength of PowerShell, but in the SQL world, it's not quite as accepted, I guess. I don't know. I have to evangelize it a lot more there. And so that's kind of my shtick. I blog at mikefall.net. So if you're looking for, stuff around SQL Server and PowerShell, how I use the two together, you'll find a lot of those posts up on my blog. As Eric said, I'm a newly minted data platform MVP for Microsoft. And I've got the MCSE, the new MCSE, not the old MCSE. So enough about me. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about tonight. So the agenda for tonight is just a few things. So first off, we're going to talk about what is SQL PS. And this is a little bit of a misnomer because when I first put this together, there was only one module, and that was SQL PS. There's actually two modules now. We're going to get more into the detail of that. So we're going to talk about what is SQL PS and what is the other module called SQL Server that offers SQL functionality in PowerShell. With that, we're going to talk about the provider, which comes with this module. And again, most of the time I have to explain this, what a provider is to the SQL folks. You guys, as PowerShell folks, probably already know it, so it might be a little bit of review, but we're going to touch on it, and specifically how the SQL Server provider works and what we can do with it. We're going to talk about commandlets and functions. I mean, that's the core thing with PowerShell is if you want to do anything, you're going to have a commandlet that you can use. So we're going to talk about the SQL commandlets that come with the module. And then I always like to talk about practical use, things that I actually use these things for, these commandlets for, some stuff that's actual, useful, as opposed to, hey, here's a bunch of cool things and, it could be used for something, but we really don't know what. I like to talk about real world experience where I can. Now, this next slide, this is usually, again, a disclaimer I throw for SQL people who aren't really that familiar with PowerShell, but this is always like, hey, don't focus on the code, focus on the concepts. This deck and the code samples with it are available. I have a GitHub repo, so you guys can go download it and pick it apart at your own leisure. And certainly, you guys, again, probably more familiar with what I'm going to be talking about with the PowerShell. Most of the SQL guys are like, what is this strange black voodoo magic? So, no worries there. But again, as I go through code, I'll probably walk through it and kind of touch on things. But really the idea is if you're, curious about the exact syntax, download the code samples and pick it apart. Now, of course, the other thing I like to say is please feel free to ask questions. With the webinar here, I'm mostly going to be charging ahead. I'll try and pause at certain points to take any questions if they're out there. But feel free, Eric, to unmute and interrupt me and ask a question if you guys have one. So that's it. That's the ground rules. That's the agenda. So let's start from the beginning. Let's get into exactly what we're talking about here. PowerShell's been around for a while, right? And it's, in fact, we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of the release of PowerShell, which is really cool. Now, as a core Windows operating piece of functionality, framework, scripting language, whatever it's pretty well accepted there. But SQL Server, it's had a bit of a rough road. And a lot of this has been, the SQL team hasn't had a whole lot of with them. They released some stuff early on. It's actually, I think PowerShell, I know PowerShell's been part of the SQL platform since 2008, but it's been in various states of doneness, if you will. So it's had some gotchas and some clunkiness, but that's starting to get better. The first thing that came out, when they first released it, was this module called SQL PS. And even actually in the beginning with 2008, it was not a module. It was actually a snap-in, thinking back to PowerShell 1.0 days. Now in SQL 2012, they actually converted it over to a module. And this is what has all the SQL-specific functionality that combines in with PowerShell. A couple things about it is it was built on PowerShell 2.0, so it has a lot of backwards compatibility. It also means that some of the functionality doesn't take advantage of newer things that have been released in PowerShell since then. We'll talk about it a little more as we get into the gotchas of the module, but there's also some struggles with it where it's actually, if you use the SQL PS module in certain situations, you're locked into using PowerShell 2.0. So that's a little bit frustrating. But this has been around now for a while, and it has a lot of the core functionality. There's been stuff added with each new version, but not a whole lot. It's been mostly around some of the new feature set, and it has, like I said, had some clunkiness to it. Now, to load it up, just like anything else, we would use import module with the 2012 version or greater. And it just loads like any other module. There are, again, some gotchas we'll talk about as we get into some more details around it. But other than that, there's nothing too crazy there. Now, I mentioned though that there's some clunkiness with it. There's some issues with it, and it was kind of neglected. Well, starting March of this year, the SQL Tools team has taken a renewed interest in PowerShell and SQL Server. In fact, they now have a dedicated PowerShell resource on the team. Now, what this has meant is in July of this year, so Management Studio, which is the tools team, that's their flagship product. Now that is starting as part of Microsoft's new Agile process, Agile release cycles. They're releasing Management Studio, any updates to it, on a monthly basis. And this started back in July of this year. So July of this year, they also released a new version of the PowerShell module, this SQL Server module. Now, really what they did is they took SQL PS, they did some bug fixes around it, and then basically renamed it. So the SQL PS module is essentially deprecated, and they copied it into the SQL Server module that they're now starting to add new functionality to, new commandlets. It only comes with Management Studio, so if you want to use it, you have to actually install whatever the current version of Management Studio is. But it does have a lot of bug fixes, and they're adding pretty much with every new release cycle or every new month more commandlets. And we're talking about some of the ones that they've added since this July release. Now, because of the nature of it, and because it encapsulates all the SQL PS functionality, the two are not compatible. So you can't run one and the other at the same time. You can run one or the other. And this can be, this isn't really a big deal for the most part, but it is a gotcha if you start to use, if you install Management Studio and you want to use SQL Server, but something might try and load SQL PS, just something to be aware of. As far as these getting installed, the trick of this is the module doesn't get installed on its own, which is a bit of a frustration for me. In fact, I have a Connect item out there about this. You want to install the PowerShell modules, you basically just install some component of SQL Server, and this gets installed with the shared components. depending on what you're installing, is what you'll get if you'll get SQL PS or the SQL Server. Now, SQL PS, it goes into actually program files, Microsoft SQL Server. You'll see the 130 underlined here. That 130 underline basically is the version number of whatever platform of SQL you're installing. So it's going to be 130 for 2016, 120 for 2014, etc. But it installs the SQL PS module into this file location. Whereas the SQL Server module, one of the great things that the tools team said was, why are we putting this in a special folder? We should just put this into the standard Windows PowerShell modules folder, for custom code. So, SQL Server actually goes into program files, Windows PowerShell modules, which I like a lot more. But like I said, it just gets installed when you install either Management Studio or some other SQL component. Now, one of the big important things to talk about when we start talking about what is this and what makes up this module is the idea of objects and .NET, right? So, for PowerShell, I always, I hammer this on the desk, is everything in PowerShell is an object, and more specifically, everything is a .NET object. This is a key principle for PowerShell, and it's really important to kind of get across to the SQL folks, because it's like we're not dealing with something like corn shell or bash shell where things are integers and strings. We're dealing with robust objects can do a lot for us. What this means for SQL Server is everything's using the SMO, or SQL Server Management Objects, and this is a .NET library. It's been around for, I think, since 2002. Obviously been upgraded, gone through many iterations. Every time a new version of SQL Server comes out, they update it. But this is what the PowerShell components for SQL Server are built on. Now, the reason this is important, or this is a big deal, is the reason that one of the things about having everything run on .NET, why this is important, is it creates this commonality of experience, because if you're building PowerShell using .NET objects, well, most other Windows tools use .NET objects, okay? So, no different with SQL Server. We've got the SMO, and the other thing that uses the SMO to run stuff is Management Studio. Again, for you guys, I'm not sure if this is really a big revelation, but for the SQL folks, this is huge, because they're like, well, I use Management Studio every day. And I'm telling them, yeah, that's great, because Management Studio and the SQL Server PowerShell modules both interact with SQL Server in the same way, using the same libraries and the same objects, and it's just just different paths at getting at it. And that's that commonality of experience and commonality of interface that makes this all just easier to work with. And this takes away a bit of the the veil of mystery about PowerShell from the SQL Server guys, because then once they start seeing that, oh, hey, Management Studio, I know, does all these things. Are you telling me PowerShell does it the same way? Cool. I can start using it a little more. One thing I put this in here just occasionally to mention to people, it does require, if you're using the SMO, the .NET 2.0 libraries, which right now means you got to install Net Framework Core as a Windows component. Now, when you fire up this module, it loads a bunch of assemblies, and this is a wall of text. I'm not expecting you guys to look at this, but these are all the different SMO assemblies that get loaded in when we start up the module, and this is everything that's there that the PowerShell components run with. So, that's it. This is like I said, the core of the functionality. This is the base of stuff that we need to use to start using PowerShell with SQL Server. So with that, I'm going to pause real quick. Any questions so far before I jump into a demo, Eric?
Anybody with a question so far? I have one. Mike, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
All right, great. So you were describing the differences between SQL PS and SQL Server modules, and that the SQL Server module comes with the regular updates with SSMS.
Yep.
I'm presuming this is not something you want to be messing around with on the SQL Server, right? So when I do my install of SQL Server, I can install the SQL PS tools, and I guess that's when it does that module creation and the SQL Server install
Yeah.
directory.
Okay. So there's this is where it starts to get funky, and there's a part of me that this is why I want to have a separate install for the module. So if I install SQL Server, the engine, any base SQL component, or I set up SQL Server, it's going to install the SQL PS module. Always is going to install it. That's just part of the install. And then if I install Management Studio, from one of the SSMS updates on top of it onto the same box, I now have both modules installed to the same machine. And that means I can't load one or the other. I have to basically load only one of those two. And if I'm using, ad hoc scripts or whatnot, I can use SQL Server. Now, the trick of this is, you can load, if you're writing just straight up PowerShell scripts, you can load whatever module you want. But if I'm using the SQL Server agent, or if I, right click in Management Studio and start a PowerShell task, it's going to launch this thing called SQLPS.exe, which is not the SQL PS module. It's a wrapper for it, and I don't know why they separated this out. But SQLPS.exe is hard-coded to load SQL PS. This means that, when I want to build a PowerShell job step in SQL Agent, it's going to be forced to use the SQL PS module. I don't really want to dive too deeply into this because it starts to get pretty confusing. If you're interested, I have a blog post kind of on all this. I think it's from like maybe a month and a half ago. I can get the exact blog post for you, where I really dive in and walk through all this. But like I said, really, you can install both, but it's going to use one or the other. Does that answer your question?
I think I wanted to call that out, as to like best practice. I mean, is that really something you would want to try to maintain on a production database server, or would you be running your scripts on your client machine, or maybe another server with that everybody connects to SQL Server Management Studio?
Right. I guess I would probably try and I would if I had to have the new components, I would try and keep all the different boxes updated and run, because I like to run scripts locally if I can. The central stuff can make things easier, and certainly from a management standpoint, that would be probably the easiest way to do it. I guess at this point, I would just go to you and say, your miles may vary. There really isn't a best practice for this right now because, again, a lot of this stuff is still maturing and still evolving. It was only a few months ago that the SQL Server team, the tools team, said, hey, now we're going to start updating this again. And it might turn out that if you look at the SQL Server module, some of the new commandlets you may not really need or have a use for. So you're happy with the SQL PS functionality.
I guess I'm asking is, if you're going to be putting that on your SQL Server, just be wary.
Yes.
You're going to have to maintain that, and it's on a regular cadence. So
exactly.
Think long and hard about that.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that we can push them sometime here in the next couple of months to allow you to install the modules separately without the dependence on Management Studio, because that would make it a lot easier. Like if they put it up on the PowerShell gallery. The other gotcha just to be aware of, because it's dependent on, or it's part of the Management Studio install, that means if you want to use this on server core machines, you're not going to be able to do it. So we'll call it out. I don't really have any good guidance around there. Just want to make sure you guys are aware of the two and how they're different.
All right, that was the only question.
Okay, cool, no problem. So let's actually dive into, let's look at some of this. And I'm actually going to the top here of the script. So I'm going to be using the SQL Server module for this because I want to show a couple of the new commandlets, but a lot of this, it's going to be pretty similar if you use SQL PS. Now, before
I'm sorry, can you pump the font up for us?
I was just about to ask that. Let's increase this up. How's that?
That looks good to me. Thanks.
Okay, no problem. So, okay, well, let's just get started here looking and exploring a few things. So, I always tell folks, keep in mind your kind of your key commands, but we can look at get module, list available, and just filter on star SQL star. And when I do this, you're going to see that I get a couple things back. Let me actually expand the command window here so we can see this a little better. Now, don't worry about SQL configuration or X SQL Server. This is a custom module of mine, and this is the DSC resource for SQL Server that I've been playing around with. But you'll see here that SQL Server, like we said, is installed with program files, Windows PowerShell modules. And then we have on top of this as well, I've got also SQL AS Cmdlets and SQL PS. Now, just so you're aware, this is actually one of the things that they changed with the new module. Previous with SQL PS, you had two different modules for SQL Server. You had the PS module, which was all the SQL Server components, and then you had SQL AS, which was for analysis services. And I don't know anybody who's been using the analysis service commandlets, but I'm sure they're out there. And there was this dependency where it would always load the SQL AS commandlets. With SQL Server, I believe they merged the two. It might still have a dependency on the SQL AS, but just so you're aware that it's there, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Now we can go let's look at some of the files for the SQL Server module. And again, a lot of these files are going to be the same for SQL PS. So if we go look in that module, you're going to see we got a lot of DLL files. Nothing too surprising here. We've got a couple format files. But really the key things that I'd like to touch on here is we have this SQL Server.ps1, which gets loaded when we fire it up. We have a data file for it, which we're not going to dive into. And then we have a PostScript file. So we're just going to crack those open just to see what we're dealing with. So with the SQL Server file, not a whole lot happens. There's a couple global variables that they create to manage the SQL Server provider. A couple things that, as you're working through the provider and you're trying to tab complete stuff that are there. I don't really have a whole lot of use for these or any recommendations for if they should be changed or not. They just work, and for the most part, I don't pay any attention to them. Now, the PostScript is more important because this does a couple things for us. So first off, the function SQL Server here, this is actually creating our SQL Server Provider drive, which we're going to talk about in the next section. Now, we set a couple aliases. This is one of the bug fixes that happened with SQL PS, because previously in SQL PS, you had two commandlets called encode SQL name and decode SQL name. Now, these don't match the naming standard for PowerShell. And so what they did, so with SQL PS, every time you loaded it, you would get a warning because it's saying, hey, you've got these two commandlets that don't match the naming standard. It's not a big deal. It still loaded the module. It's just saying you got stuff that people may not be able to find intuitively. Now, the SQL Tools team, as one of the bug fixes, said, hey, this isn't right. So they changed the commandlets to be these convert to and convert from commandlets, which match the naming standard. And now they have two aliases so they can have backwards compatibility. And this gets around that. We do load a couple additional assemblies here. And then, yeah, okay, they didn't merge it, but they still have the dependency on the SQL AS commandlets, which really isn't a big deal, except if you try and load this on a computer that doesn't have an analysis services instance on it, it's going to throw a warning, but it's something you can ignore. So anyway, there's just some interesting stuff going in here. Now, one of the things, if you've played around with SQL PS before, like in one of the earlier versions, you might notice that you import SQL PS and suddenly it throws you into the SQL Server drive. Well, that's because in this file for SQL PS, there's a set location command to do that. So one of the hacks I always will tell people, if you're tired of that, just go into your SQL Server PostScript and comment that line out, and it won't do that to you anymore. So let's look at a little bit of what we've got. So again, loading the module is no big deal. We just run import module SQL Server, and it loads the module. No fanfare, no fanciness. Now, if this were SQL PS, like I said, we would have probably seen a warning there about commandlets not matching the naming standard. Again, don't worry about it. Not a big deal. Just be aware that we have those encode and decode commandlets that exist. And again, I always tell people, if you want to see what's there, your good friend git command. We'll do that with the module SQL Server. And I'm going to run the other one just to see how many commandlets we have. So it's going to list up a bunch of stuff. And yep, there we go. And so we have 82 commandlets, but I'm going to expand this out. Now the 82 is including all the updates. So I have the most recent version. I believe it was 45 or 46 commandlets in SQL PS before they started adding new stuff with the Management Studio updates. But we've got a bunch of stuff here. You're going to see stuff like write SQL table data. We're going to look at that one in a bit. We've got a couple things to manage availability groups. So availability database, availability group. We can set SQL authentication mode, though that one's not as cool as it may sound. We'll talk about that in a bit. There's a variety of commandlets to do a bunch of different things, and we're going to talk more about those in detail. But this is really kind of the general entry point, all the different stuff we have to work with. So with that, I'm going to jump back to the slide deck. If there are no questions, don't worry about it. But if there are, just pop up. Nope, no questions. So moving right along, let's talk about the provider. Again, talking with PowerShell folks, you guys probably are like, oh yeah, providers, I know all about those. But for those who may not be aware, when they were first putting PowerShell together, they're like, well, it's a command line experience. And there's a lot of stuff with the Windows environment that doesn't really display well in a command line environment. We've got lots of GUIs to explore, like things like the registry. The registry is probably the biggest example. And so Snover and his team, who when they came together on this, they're like, well, how do we expose this? And they came up with this thing called providers, which basically the idea of a provider is you can expose different parts of the Windows stack as if it were a file system. There's nothing really fancy here. It's just we've got providers for the file system, but we also have providers for things like the registry, for PowerShell functions that are in memory, aliases, certificates, all this stuff that we can browse as a file system. And we can look at them all by using git ps drive. Nothing fancy, nothing crazy there. There is one for SQL Server, and this becomes really handy, particularly from an exploratory sense. If you need a way to get information about your SQL instances and your SQL servers, the provider can be a very handy way to do it, just like doing directory lookups for files and for other file system components. We can start to do this with different SQL components. If we look here at this screenshot in the slide, we're going to see stuff like we've got a provider. Within the provider, we've got stuff for the data tier application components. So if you use SSDT, there's stuff like that. We've got stuff for policy-based management, registration. If you're using central management server, that would be in there. Of course, we have the SQL database engine under SQL. And this is all under, if you look in the upper left, the SQL Server drive. So there's an actual SQL Server drive that we can use that we're going to access all this stuff in. Now, the other thing I like to call out is the general file structure for how this works, because it tends to relate to SQL servers and how they are interacted with. So first off, we have a SQL Server drive. That's the provider that we can see there at the bottom. The next folder that we're going to have declared is the component that we want to browse into. So if it's the SQL engine, we're going to browse into SQL. If we wanted to do SQL registration, we would go into SQL registration, SQL AS for analysis services, so on and so forth. But then beyond that, we get this consistency of the next folder is going to be the host or the server that we want to work on, and then the next folder is the instance. And the reason this is important is because with every SQL Server installation, we can have multiple instances on a machine. So there's this loose association, but it's not like, okay, well, we go to this one host and that's the same instance we're looking in. We could have multiple instances, so they had to account for that in the folder structure. So nothing too crazy, but you know, it becomes a handy way for us to explore and see stuff. Now, this is probably a little bit abstract, so let's just dive into some code and see how this actually operates. So we're back here in the demo. I'm going to do a quick clear screen just to get things off, and let's move on to looking at some stuff. So we can do a get PS drive to list all of our providers. And as you can see, this comes up with all the different providers we have attached. We have our A, C, D, E. These are our typical file system providers. You know, so that's the thing. One of the things that's kind of cool is, you know, the providers, it's this abstract idea, and whether it's a file system or whether it's the registry or whether it's certificates or SQL Server, they all have their own providers. So they all kind of have these same entry points into managing the Windows stack. And so, yeah, here we have our SQL Server provider. It has that name. That's the type of provider it is. Big shock, it's SQL Server. And the root drive. Now, we do have current location when I was messing around with this, so if I just changed into it, it would probably go into this. We're not going to worry about it too much. And we could get more information if we wanted to look specifically at it. We could use the get PS drive, PS provider, SQL Server. So let's just dive in. And again, we're going to be using file system operations, so directory lookups that we're kind of used to using. I'm going to change directory, or, you know, that's an alias for set location. I'm going to change that to SQL Server, and then we'll do a directory lookup. And this is where we get that list of components that we were looking at on the slide in the PowerPoint deck. Here's our data tier applications. We got data collectors, policy, bunch of different components. We're mostly going to be working here in the SQL Server engine provider. And again, this is a good way to just start browsing information. Now I'm going to change directory for SQL and do a directory lookup. And you'll notice I get a warning. So this is an interesting piece here, because when I do a directory lookup on SQL engine, it starts looking in the local host. It's going to assume that, hey, you know, I'm going to look at whatever's here. And this is something of a functionality of the SMO. We're going to talk about how the SMO and the provider interact here in a bit. But really what we're looking at is, because I'm running this on, where we're at right now, the server that I'm doing this on does not have SQL installed. It only has the tool set. So because SQL is not installed, that's why we get this warning. We can still, though, we're going to change directory to Picard, which is one of my SQL servers, and we'll do a directory lookup there. And when we do this, and it takes a little bit to connect, you'll see that now we get an instance name back, and that's because we have a default instance installed on Picard. So just because we did a directory on SQL, it didn't see SQL Server installed on other machines. It doesn't have any knowledge of that, and with the SMO, it doesn't go out and explore that. It's kind of the same thing if I open up Management Studio and click my drop-down for SQL instances. It's not going to show me stuff that it's not aware of, and so it's that same interface there. But we can still change directory to a known SQL Server, and as you can see, we have an instance name. Now, I'm going to change directory into that instance and do another directory lookup. Takes a little bit here. Again, it's got to go out and query the instance, and my poor VM lab's probably a little bit overwhelmed with resources and running PowerPoint and all these other things. I could probably, let me see about turning a few things off here. But as it's starting to come up, yeah, here we go. So this is, now again, I don't know with your guys' experience with Management Studio, but this is kind of where I do a little bit of a mind blow for the SQL folks, because what they're seeing here, all these components that are under the instance. So we're now in the SQL engine, the Picard machine, the default instance. We get all these items, and these are things that you would normally see on the left-hand side of your object browser in Management Studio, if you guys have worked in Management Studio. So we've got stuff like backup devices, databases, obviously, logins, which would be under our security tab. The job server is a little weird. This is our SQL agent, but it's there. So we have all these components that we're used to seeing in SQL Server, and it just shows up as a directory lookup. Let's go ahead and we're going to do a change directory into databases. Now, before I run the full directory with the dash force here, let's see here. Apologies. Looks like my VMs are starting to choke up a little bit on themselves. I'm going to see if I can shut a few things down to speed this up. I also might want to blame it on Chrome. Chrome's a pig. I don't know why we're using it for Hangouts. Just kidding. Let's see here. Okay, so we're in databases. Let's go ahead and do a directory lookup without the force switch. And when we do this, wow, this is taking a fairly long time. I apologize. Eric, are you going to unmute there?
Since we're at a Microsoft location, we'll blame Hangouts for the lag.
Okay. I'm just kidding. I'm just poking fun at you.
So basically, Mike, just to reiterate on the provider, you CD into the SQL functionality, and then you CD into a server, right? So
Yeah.
right now you're at the card, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a VM locally. This would be another server in your enterprise in a different data center. You could CD to that server.
Yeah, so in my VM lab, the machine that I'm currently running this on, this is my Active Directory controller because I only have 3 machines in my VM lab. But I'm essentially connecting to a remote SQL server in that same VM lab. So it's VMs, but it's no different than if I were dealing with physical machines in an enterprise or other stuff, right? It's pretty straightforward. So yeah, we're coming at this all remotely, and that's kind of my thing. Is PowerShell has this whole remote management functionality built into it, which is really great about it, right? So we've got the directory lookup that came back, and you'll see that we only have the one database. Now, for those of you who are familiar with SQL Server, you're like, oh, well, where are my system databases? And this is one thing I like to call out with the provider is it is kind of, by default, they abstract away the system objects. So we only see the user databases when we do this directory lookup, and I only have the one user database on my SQL instance. If I use the force switch, though, the force will actually force it to show the system databases. So now if I do the directory dash force, it's going to go ahead and, once it comes up, have a listing of all of my databases, including my system databases. Yeah, see, so it's starting to come up here. All right, almost there. Almost there. I may restart my VMs after this just to, yeah, so this all comes up, and now we're looking at all the databases. Now, the one thing I always like to call out is if we look at get member for these objects that we're returning here, if we just get item of the worldwide importers, it could be any database, what's this going to show us? And this is coming back to everything's built on a .NET object. So what we're going to get back here at some point is, let's actually go ahead and shut that down. So with this all coming back, I can get up, let's hide the script pane. And we'll go all the way to the top past all these properties and methods. We're going to see that what we're dealing with is a Microsoft SQL Server Management SMO database. So everything we're working with through the provider here is an SMO object of some sort or another. What this means is when we did the directory lookup here, see, we're getting name and status and containment type, but we really, that's just what's exposed by the format stuff. We actually have access to a bunch of other things. So if I do a directory lookup, and this time I'm going to pull out the name, the create date, I'm going to do some math on data space usage to convert it from kilobytes to megabytes, and then we'll format that as a table. So we can still do directory lookups on everything in the provider, but now we can see more information about our databases. If this will come back. Apologies again. I'm sorry, guys. I really don't know what to say here with getting these things to return the data.
Hey, no problem, Mike. If you wanted to reboot one of your VMs, go for it. Just
yeah, no, it's fine. Okay, so here we go. As you can see, I'm pulling back those properties. So we've got the database, when it was created, and how big it was. Now, we could go further into just so you know, we're only looking at just some of the stuff on the surface. We could go even further because there's, all sorts of folders. If we did a directory lookup on wide world importers, we're going to see a bunch of stuff, including tables. Any of the objects within the database are going to be in there. I'm going to actually stop that because that's just going to... anyway, so we can go through and browse a bunch of this stuff, and we can browse all of our databases as if it was a file system, the whole advantage of providers. Now, where does this start to become cool? This is where I turn to the SQL people, because they're going to be like, well, I can get all this stuff from a system view, right? I can do a select star from sys.databases and bring up most of this information, or I can write queries with my joins and bring this all up. Where this starts to get cool is when you start to talk about multi-server execution. Again, your PowerShell folks, you guys probably already get this. PowerShell is really cool for the multi-server stuff. So what I'm going to do is I've got two servers. Actually, let me power that other one up so it will actually return data here. But what we've got is we've got a collection of servers, and you can build this collection anyway, right? I do it with just an explicit string array, but you could get content from a text file, or you could select from a database table, however you want to do it. But we're going to do a for each object, and then for each of those, get the servers, and then do our select, our same select here with all the other properties. And now we're going to do it across multiple servers. So if I run this, it's going to go out. And ultimately what we would get back is this with across my two servers, my Riker and my Picard server. So I'm just going to let that run. I'm not going to worry about it too much more because obviously it's oh, there it goes. See, just as I start to make excuses for how long it's taking, it completes on me to make me look like an idiot. All right. But you see, now I can do a directory lookup across multiple servers, and I can get a single report to show, here's my databases, and I can say, here's all the databases, when they were created, how big they are. And there's even more we can do, which we're going to see in some later examples. So with that, I'm going to take another quick short break for any questions. Anything come up, Eric, or shall we just keep moving on? I don't hear anything.
Yeah, you're good. We'll give you a thumbs up if we're okay.
Okay, cool. I will try and watch the camera then a little better. All right, so let's go back to the slide deck and just talk about a few gotchas with the provider. Timeouts. Now, we did notice, obviously, I've got the VM, and it seemed like, the VM was taking a bit to respond, but some of that is also built in, the way the SMO works. So the SMO, with all these .NET objects, it's got a lot of the SQL Server defaults built in for connectivities, for testing stuff. And one of the things there is it's a default of 30 seconds to timeout. Now, what does that mean to us? That means that, like, okay, if I go in and I say change directory and I mistype a machine name, again, it doesn't have any prior knowledge, so I can't really tab complete machine names or instance names. So if I try and change directory to something like that and I mistype it, I fat finger it, I gotta wait 30 seconds for it to finish. So that's just one of the clunkiness pieces of it. And because it's an SMO thing, there's not really a whole lot that you can do to get around it. And this also means that, again, we talked about tab completion. IntelliSense really, it doesn't work so well with the SQL Server Provider folder structures. Really all you gotta, you just gotta know what's there, become familiar with your stuff, or be a little patient with it. The other weirdness with the provider is contextual behavior. This one's a little, I was trying to find a good way to describe it. This is the best thing that I could. If I'm in the provider, if I'm in that SQL Server Provider, and then I try and create a new item that's a file, I'm going to get an error. And the reason is because when you're in the SQL Server Provider, if I type new item, it's going to try and use it in the context of the database object, which is odd because new item doesn't have an implementation for the SQL Server Provider, but it's going to get confused. So if you're going to do file system operations or anything like that, you want to make sure you're out of that SQL Server Provider before you do it. Just a gotcha, something to be aware of. Cool. So with that, I'm going to just move on to the commandlets. Again, this slide I always like to talk to you about the verb-noun construct for commandlets. People will be aware of that. I'm going to assume you guys know that, and we'll just move along. Currently, the state of the commandlets is we have 79 commandlets. Now, I know when I did the count, it was 82. But really, that 82 includes the function for the provider, which really isn't a commandlet, and then the two aliases, which, again, aren't commandlets. So we're dealing with 79 different commandlets, and I've got kind of 6 categories that I break them out into. These categories are my own construction. Microsoft has had no say, they didn't tell me what these were. I just was looking at the commandlets and trying to figure out which was what. We've got 22 for availability group management. We've got 19 for always encrypted, and these are some of the new commandlets that were added in the SSMS update of July 2016, because always encrypted is a new feature for SQL 2016, and so they were adding commandlets to support it. There are 19 general purpose. They do just a mishmash of things. We're going to talk a little bit more of those. There's 6 commandlets for managing the SQL Server agent. This is cool. We can get agent jobs and agent job schedules and get those SMO objects if we want to manipulate them using those commandlets. The 7 for cloud management. These are the 7 that I hate. And that's because back in the day, and we'll talk about this a little more in detail, but back in the day, the SQL team was like, oh, we're going to make some commandlets specifically for managing SQL and Azure VMs, which they thought was cool, but was really clunky and didn't work very well for the rest of us, and certainly catches a lot of people by surprise as they try to use them. We'll talk about those in a bit. And then finally, there's 6 commandlets for managing backups and restores, and those are actually pretty useful, and I use those a lot. So looking at some of these commandlets, just general purpose, here's some of the commandlets that we would see under the general purpose. I actually don't have all of them here because I don't have some of the new ones, but just some of the ones that we're looking at. So the encode, decode, we talked about those that don't match the PowerShell naming standard. Again, those are aliases now in the SQL Server module, and they map to convert to and convert from encoded SQL name. The other 2 here that I find particularly useful is if you're using policy-based management, invoke policy evaluation is pretty cool because it allows you to remotely invoke SQL Server policies using that commandlet. But the real big one here is invoke SQL CMD. This is one of my workhorse commandlets, because what this is this is a wrapper for SQL CMD that allows me to execute SQL commands in PowerShell. It's real easy for me to put just a SQL script or put a SQL statement into a string and just call it from this and get me some results. We're going to dive into that in the demo, but one of the big ones that I like to use. Looking at some other ones here, so the backup and the restore commandlets, again, these are some that I heavily use, and the two big ones, backup SQL database and restore SQL database. They do pretty much what they say. You know, they do standard backup and restore operations. Now, the other commandlets, so the backup encryption option is one they introduced with SQL 2014, because with SQL 2014, you could start to encrypt your backups. So they needed to have a PowerShell commandlet to manage that encryption. The other three commandlets are used to manage what's called managed backups for SQL Server, or they have this term called Smart Admin. Basically, with SQL 2014, they introduced the ability to back up to URL, that URL being Azure Blob Storage. So I can directly back up a SQL Server database to Azure Blob Storage, which opens up whole new worlds of disaster recovery and managing your backups and storage management. But what they also added was this ability to enable managed backups. And so all I do is I enable the managed backup for a database backup, and what SQL Server will do is take over the backing up of that database. And what it does is it will back it up to Azure Blob Storage, and it will figure out when full backups and log backups need to happen on its own without any intervention by the user. So there's no scheduling of jobs or creating things by myself. It just does it. And what basically the parameters are, it will do a full backup once every 7 days or sooner, depending on whether or not it determines if that's necessary. Or it will, or in the log backups, it will do once every 15 minutes or more if there's enough change. And this is all, like I said, it's all managed by SQL Server. The idea is for folks who aren't like DBAs who have a whole lot of knowledge about scheduling and setting up all these backup jobs. The idea is hey, you can just turn this on and your database will get backed up to Azure and you don't have to worry about it. So some good things about it, some bad things about it. And we have PowerShell commandlets to manage that. So moving on, so the cloud management, let's talk about these, because these are the ones that I hate and the ones that you probably won't ever have to use. In fact, I would say avoid them. We look at these and we've got a couple different ones. So first off, all these commandlets require what's called the Cloud Adapter Service. The Cloud Adapter Service is a specialized Windows service that is installed on all Azure VMs. It's just part of the package, which means that these commandlets were designed for that. But if you want to run them on anything other than an Azure VM, you have to install that Cloud Adapter Service. Next up, a lot of these either don't do what you think they would do, or they do something that's duplicated elsewhere. So if we look at the first two, add SQL Firewall Rule and remove SQL Firewall Rule, I already have new Net Firewall Rule and set Net Firewall Rule and remove Net Firewall Rule. I already have core PowerShell commandlets to manage my firewalls. And they're actually more detailed. If I use add SQL Firewall Rule, all it does is it creates a firewall rule across all my profiles to the SQL Server executable. It doesn't give me any more control than that, whereas with the new Net Firewall Rule, I can create it for specific profiles. I can create it on IP addresses, applications. I can open up specific ports. It's a lot more fine-grained. And the same with start and stop SQL instance. Again, I have start and stop service. Why would I need these? And they really don't give you anything, and in fact are more of a pain in the butt because they rely on that Cloud Adapter Service. So these commandlets, I pretty much say ignore them. Don't mess with them. They're just not worth it. Now, these are all the different availability group management commandlets. They introduced a lot of this with, I think, SQL 2012 when they came out with it. Now, using these as an advanced topic, I, in fact, have a whole presentation dedicated to how these get used. So we're not going to really get into them, but I just want to show you this wall of text to make sure you're aware that they're there. And then finally, we have a bunch of commandlets that were added with the July 2016 update. So again, 18 commandlets for always encrypted. We have 6 commandlets for the agent and a couple. Those are the 2 SQL error that I put in a general purpose. And they've actually added a few more since then. So this is just the quick we spent a good chunk of time on this, but this is all the different commandlets. There's a lot of options, even with the 80-some. I mean, you go to some modules and they have a couple hundred commandlets. So we only have the 80-some, but there's a lot of stuff that we can do with that. Eric, any questions? I'm watching the video monitor. Oh, you're coming up.
No, we're good.
Okay.
No, we're good. Thanks.
All right, so let's dive back into the VM and see if we're still going to have things. Things might still be running slowly, but we can still walk through this. So we already so get SQL database is one of the easiest commandlets to understand. We declare a server instance, we declare a name of a database, and this is going to return the SMO object of that database. So as you can see, this comes back. This looks a lot like that directory lookup we did with the provider, right? We've got the name, status, containment type, etc. So we're returning that SMO object that is that specific database. So that's pretty, that can be handy if you need to get the SMO object and you just want to start working with it directly without having to mess with the provider path. Now I've got the get SQL instance. This is one of the cloud commandlets, and excuse me, this is weird just because it doesn't. I would expect, looking at the name of this, that this would return an SMO SQL Server object. It doesn't. It returns an infrastructure IaaS object, automation object. And if I actually run this, it's going to ask me for a credential, which is weird because most of this other stuff doesn't. The reason it is it's looking for a Windows operating system credential that can access the box. And it's going to go looking for that cloud adapter service. Now, spoiler alert, I don't have the cloud adapter service installed on any of my lab VMs, so this is going to fail. So we'll just cancel that. It's going to give me an error. I only show this to say this is why some of all the cloud stuff will not, it doesn't do what you would expect it to do, so avoid them. Let's look at the invoke SQL CMD now. So I've got a SQL statement. I'm just going to set the variable here. Without getting too much into the detail, this will show us a count of database by owner. So we're going to look at the different owners and how many databases they own. Now, if you've used SQL Server, maybe you use from the command line, you use something called SQL CMD, which has been since 2005 the command line tool for running SQL Server. And we can run this command, we run a SQL statement there, and it's what we would expect it to be, right? We've got the output from the query, we've got a name, we've got, for each one, SA, we've got a database count of 4. So, okay, not a big shocker there. Now, if we run the invoke SQL CMD, which should basically be the same thing, right? It's a command line utility. We're executing the same SQL statement. Now you'll see, though, we get the same data back, but it's a little more, it's neater, right? It's a little more organized, and there's a reason for this. This may seem a little odd, but what we're looking at here, it's actually a difference of what's coming out of these two commandlets. So I'm going to stuff both of the outputs of these into variables. And then we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to skip this because we're just returning the outputs. But if we look at, we're going to look at get member on SQL CMD. So this is the output of SQL CMD. And if we look at the object that's coming out of this, so SQL CMD gives us a collection of system.strings. So one of the things that about SQL CMD that doesn't make it useful is we're getting strings, and they're just big long strings for each row in the return set. So that means all of our columns are basically mashed into one string, our headers mashed into one string. This means it's not all that useful to us for parsing out data, we'd have to do a lot of string manipulation. Whereas if we look at invoke SQL CMD, the output from that, what you're going to see here is, let's move that out of the way and scroll up. We're actually dealing with the collection of data rows. And this makes our data a little more robust coming out of it and easier to manage. You'll notice our columns are now properties of the object, where before we didn't have that. And that means if we want to retrieve specific columns or values, all we need to do is reference that property. It makes it a whole lot easier to manage the data. And I use this commandlet for all sorts of activity. Anytime I need to automate a SQL statement, I'm going to run it through invoke SQL CMD. And if I need to extract data, it gives me a handy object of using this stuff, or of managing my data. Okay, cool. Moving along, another command I want to talk about. This is one of the ones that was introduced with the September update of Management Studio. So one of the brand new, fresh commandlets. One of the things SQL folks will always ask me about when I'm talking about PowerShell and SQL Server together is, how do I load data I collect with PowerShell? How do I load that into a database table? And frankly, there really hasn't been a good way so far. The best I would recommend is the guy named Chad Miller, who Eric probably knows, wrote two functions called out SQL data, or out data table and write data table, several years ago. And those have been kind of what I've used up to this point. But now Microsoft has given us write SQL table data, which allows us to write data directly to a table. So I'm going to create a table, and all it is just a basic test data table. It's got a name, some columns here. We won't worry too much about it. And I'm going to create it on my Picard instance. So we'll go ahead and create that. And now I'm going to use this next block. So this is basically just a get WMI object block that will go to each of my running SQL servers and get volume information. So the volume names, how big they are, how much free space. And we're going to stuff that into just an object. We're going to just have a collection of those objects. So we'll do that. And if we look at that, what we stuffed in there, hey, nothing big. We got a host name property with each server name in there, the name of the volumes, the size of the volumes, and how much is free there. But because we have this object, we can now use write SQL table data. So SQL table data will take either a collection of objects, a collection of data rows, or a .NET data table, and it will write those to the table that we want to. Now, the table structure has to match the object structure, so all the columns have to be the same name. But other than that, it will just write it. So I'm going to declare a server instance, database name. I do need to declare a database schema and the table name, and then what my input data is. But once I do that, I just run this commandlet, and boom, we've just written, it's a small data set, so it's not like it's got to do a lot of work. Now I can use invoke SQL CMD to just do a select star from that test data, and that's going to bring back what we wrote there. Okay, yeah, but I've been doing all this in PowerShell. Let's actually show what we've been doing here. So I have yet to pin this to, I just rebuilt my lab yesterday, so I haven't fine-tuned some of the items here. But we're going to open up Management Studio. That might have been a bad idea. I probably should have opened it up ahead of time. Yeah, here we go. And then we will connect to Picard. Oh, no, not Riker. We want Picard. We'll connect to that. And actually, while that's running, well, it's loading up here. The one thing I do forget to do, and I should probably do this just for the query results, is, oh, I don't have Zoom It on here yet. All right. Well, you'll just have to trust me on this one. But we're going to open up a new query. And this is why, folks, when you're doing a presentation, make sure you got all your stuff opened ahead of time. So we're going to use tempdb, which is where we created this, and then we're going to do a select star from test data, just to prove that we got it. And it's going to be a little bit small down here, but there is, so there we did. We wrote the table data with that one commandlet. Can be very useful. Again, it's only with the new stuff. So if you're using SQL PS, you probably need to go out and get Chad Miller's stuff, which I use still. I mean, it's still good. But this is one of the coolest things that I think they finally got into here that I'm very happy about. So let's talk about backups and restores. So backing up SQL databases, we have a backup SQL database commandlet. And it's, if we need to back up a database, it's the easiest way to go. We just need to specify server instance, database name. We need a backup file that we're going to back it up to. I'm going to declare a couple other things such as initialize and copy only. But the first line here, I want to call out the use of the script flag. So what this does is if I run this now with the script, we're going to get as an output, you'll see here that we now have a T-SQL statement, backup database, and all the T-SQL statements here. Again, this is more for the SQL folks here, but this might be a big deal to you guys as well. Any of these commandlets, all it's doing behind the scenes is SQL commands. So again, no black voodoo magic. And we can script out what that action is going to be in SQL just by using the script flag. And this is actually the same if you've ever worked in Management Studio. If you do an action, there's going to usually have a script button in the upper left. If you click on that, it's going to give you the T-SQL command to execute the action that you just specified. And this is the same thing. It's all because we're using that SMO interface. So handy stuff can be very useful if you're looking to just script stuff out. Now, if we just run it without the script flag, it's actually going to run the backup for us. And we're going to back up wide world importers, and you can see we get a progress bar telling us how long it's taking, and it's backing it up to ctemp wide world importers back. Now, the important thing to understand about this C drive, so this C drive is the local C drive to the SQL instance. It's the same as if I was going to run a backup command in T-SQL on the Picard instance. So just be aware that if I'm making this, so if I go to, the local ctemp, which I may not have. Oh, yep, no, I do. You're going to notice that I don't have that backup file I just made. But if I look at Picard, actually, let's just do an ls. Picard, $temp. There's the backup that we just made. So it's actually 9:02 p.m. my time, 8:02 your guys' time. So, so yeah, that's backups. Pretty handy stuff. Some basic use of the commandlets. So we'll just, with that, feel free to come up and interrupt me. Otherwise, I'm going to keep plowing because I think we need to. I don't want to keep you guys too late here. So we'll go ahead and talk about, those are the commandlets. If we talk about some of the gotchas here. So first off, the one thing I always want to call out with the commandlets is, and we didn't really look into this, but there's help files for all of these. But the SQL team kind of slacked off compared to some of the other teams. So the documentation isn't all that great around these, but I do call that out as changing because the SQL tools team has gotten a lot more active on getting this documentation updated. And there's actually, even in the past 3 months with me doing this, there's been new changes to how this is all getting documented online and tracked. Next up, we talked about the unexpected behavior. So like I said, just, if you're working with the commandlets, you might want to just test it first just to make sure it's doing what you think it's going to do. Again, most of the commandlets that are there and most of the new ones that are coming out, they do what you expect them to do, but you might come across one and start using, it's like, hey, wait a minute, this isn't behaving. So just be aware. And then finally, lack of support. when I did this, so I initially built this presentation about a year ago, and I did it because the SQL team hadn't been touching, the PowerShell module. It was neglected, and there were a lot of gotchas and pitfalls and whatnot. And so I built this to say, okay, here's all the gotchas and pitfalls so nobody else stubs their toe the way that I did. However, since then, like I said, the SQL Tools team has been doing a lot more, so that lack of support is changing. So this is the good news. So with that, let's just go ahead and I say, so now what? I really don't know why I had these slides, because we're going to jump right back into the demo. I want to show you a few practical examples of how I use this stuff. I've already shown you a couple, like the provider lookup for the size of databases, the right SQL data table. I mean, we didn't really show a practical example there, but there's a lot of possibilities with that. But what I want to show you here is some other things that you can do. So first off, one of the things I always, as a SQL DBA, will have people asking me about is, what are the SQL instances? What kind of versions of SQL do I have out there? And we can easily do that with PowerShell and the provider. So we talked about the fact that these are all SMO objects. Well, one of the properties is version string of the server, and this is the numerical version ID of SQL Server. So I'm going to do a quick collection of my instances. And again, you can build your collection however you want. You can do a database table lookup. You can do a text file. You can explicitly declare the string. But then I'm going to take that instances, pipe it to for each object, and then for each of these, get the server object that is in the provider, and then we're going to pull back the name and the version string. And with this one line, and again, doesn't matter how big my collection is, I can bring back all the different versions. Now, this is the numerical version, so you're going to need some knowledge around what does that mean. And there's a great, I think it's SQLversions.blogspot or something like that. If you do a lookup of SQL versions blog, you'll be able to find it. And I can, of course, provide that link if you guys are interested. But it will tell you, I mean, this is basically SQL 2016 RTM is on both my boxes. But if I had 20 or 30 servers, I could see all the different versions. Again, this is a quick way to do an inventory and go to your management and say, hey, look, I've got some, here's some stuff that needs to be taken care of. We need to apply some service packs, what have you. Now, we can take this a step further, take those instances. Now, we did do a little bit of this when we looked at the provider of, well, let's look at all the databases and see how big they were and when they were created. Well, now I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to pull last backup date and size. So if we run this, now what we get is, here we go. Yep, so we've got the server, the database, and when it had its last full backup. And this is extremely useful because now you can start to see, are my databases getting backed up the way they should be? So we have the last backup. Fortunately, these have been both backed up in the last 24 hours. Now the size, this is in kilobytes. I would have to do that math that we saw earlier to convert it to megabytes. But still, I can see at a quick glance when my databases were backed up and how big they were. So very handy there. But let's do some more with this. Now I want to combine this with the backup SQL database commandlet. So what if I wanted to quickly back up all my databases? This particular block of code, we're going to go through each of the instances, and on each one, this first line is going to get me a list of all my system databases using the get child items and some where object filtering. Then for each of those databases, I'm going to call the backup SQL database command and dynamically declare a few things to back this up. And is that going to move over there? Yep. So apologies, that kind of jumped on us. But basically, this line 123 is going to go through each database in the collection for that instance and just do a backup for it. And that's all we need to do. Now, this last line 125 is going to show me a list of all the backups that I just made. So what is this? For 1, 2, 3, 4, and the fourth line here just as a bracket, and call it the fifth line to declare our instances collection. I'm going to back up all the system databases for all my instances in my environment. Now, it is doing it serially, just so you're aware. It's doing it one at a time. There are ways to parallelize it, but we're not going to get into that. there goes our, we're getting our progress bar just because that's the way it is. And now if we do a directory lookup on all those instances, we will see, there we go. So on Picard, there's my backups. Come along, there we go, Riker. So yeah, so I just made all these system backups. And with what, 5 lines of code? So to me, that's like super cool. The final thing I want to show you guys, so one of the big problems with me as a DBA is doing a point-in-time restore. So this might be a little unfamiliar to you if you haven't done a lot of SQL Server work, but if you're doing a SQL Server database restore and you want to do a restore to a specific point in time, you have to go through a bunch of different steps. You have to restore a full backup. Then you have to restore, if you have one, a differential backup. And then after that, you have to restore as many log file backups as you need to in order to get to a certain point of time. Now, if I'm doing this, and like I'm doing this from scratch, let's say I back my logs up once every 15 minutes. Well, if I'm backing it up once every 15 minutes, that means in one day I could have 144 log backups. So that's 4 backups an hour times 24 hours. Okay, so this starts to become, or wait, did I do that right? I might have done that math wrong, whatever. We'll just keep moving along and assume that it's a lot. So that can be a real pain in the butt for me to sit down and organize those and build out my restore script and get it all sorted. So here's where I use PowerShell. Now this is a little more complex of a block, but really what we're going to do here is line 129, I'm going to get the most recent full that I have in my backup directory. And I'm using the UNC path just to make sure I'm getting the right one. Then line 130, I'm going to get all my log backups, and I'm doing some filtering. You'll see the where object here. And I'm taking that last full that I got and just getting all the log backups that have happened after that full backup, which is the ones I'm going to need. And I sort them by date, time, ascending. Now the move file stuff, we're not going to get into. I just have to create some SMO objects to relocate the files physically. And then here's where we really get the work done. So I've got a new database name I'm going to restore, and then I'm using restore SQL database, which is the commandlet for doing that. If we go out here to the right, we're going to see there's the script switch, and I'm piping the output to a file, ctemp restore SQL. So basically what I'm doing is I just made 2 collections of my backup files. The first one, I start the file out, and this is my full where I script out the restore command. And then I loop through each of those log files that are ordered for me, and I create, ultimately, a point-in-time restore script. So I'm going to run this whole thing. And with that, so there we go. I have just created my SQL script to restore all those log files in order. And this saves me hours of time, if not more, right? Now, the reason I do it as a script, as a SQL person, this way I can go in and tweak the SQL script as necessary, adjust it to make sure it's restoring the way that I want. But really, if you guys just wanted to fire it off and restore, you can just take off the script output and just run it, and it's just going to go. So this is, to me, one of the biggest, most useful PowerShell things that I do with, around SQL Server and managing it. And like I said, this has saved me, literally over the course of probably the past year or so that I've been doing this sort of stuff, this has saved me equivalent of days worth of time total to get stuff done. So that's really it for the practical examples showing kind of how you can use some of these commandlets. We'll jump back to the slide deck. This is just the quick wrap up. So Eric, I'm just going to throw it out and see, are there any other questions? I was kind of flying there at the end, but anything that I blew past that people are curious about?
No, we do have one question.
Sure.
You can go. I had a question about invoke SQL command, invoke SQL Cmd.
Yep.
So we have a scenario where there's a SQL script that we're actually trying to run using invoke SQL Cmd,
yeah.
and it does not have this, the expected behavior of the script does not match what we see when running it in SSMS or SQL Cmd.exe. Have you seen that before?
Well, can you give me a little more detail about what the difference in behavior is?
When running the script in SQL Management Studio or SQL CMD, it throws an error like it should, whereas running it using the PowerShell commandlet will not throw the error, and it will just continue moving forward.
Okay. So it probably. So wait, does it actually? It doesn't. Normally, it would throw the error and stop. And what you're saying is, with invoke SQL CMD, it tries to run. It actually runs through the entire script.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, the script does a bunch of set no execs. It checks to see at the very top. It checks to see what the version is inside a particular table. In a database, and if it falls within the appropriate range, it will go ahead and continue to run a whole bunch of commands to make some modifications, and then at the very bottom, it checks to see. I'm trying to think on how it actually works, but it more or less checks to see if it got there successfully, and if so, it goes ahead and commits the transaction.
Okay.
But if it doesn't, it will go ahead and actually throw, It more or less throws an error, does a raise error, and that behavior is actually shown or executed properly when running it through Management Studio or the SQL CMD.
Okay.
But running it from PowerShell does not.
Okay, so the invoke SQL CMD has a little bit of a funky error handling process. So it actually probably is throwing the error, but that doesn't come out of invoke SQL CMD. You actually have to, there's a way that you have to capture that, if I recall correctly. Max Trinidad, if you're familiar with him, has a really great blog post on this, and I'd have to dig it up. But I would say just do a Google search on Max Trinidad and invoke SQL CMD error, and you should be able to find the blog post. If not, contact me and I'll get a hold of it for you. But you basically have to trap that error, and I believe in the situation you're talking about, so invoke SQL CMD, much like other commandlets, has an error action preference. So I believe you would have to declare error action preference to be stop for it to cancel. I'd have to do a little more investigation around that. What you're saying makes sense to me, just because invoke SQL CMD has a slightly different error handling process than either Management Studio or SQL CMD, but I'd have to do more direct investigation to really get a better idea of what you're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I've done a lot of investigation to try to figure out why it's happening. And you can see there's quite a few print statements included in the script, and you can see that the print statements that should not be being run are being run when using invoke SQL CMD.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I would definitely. I kind of wish I could see what you're doing, because that is something I'd like to drill into. But yeah, I would say try and find Max's post on error handling with invoke SQL CMD and see if that gives you any more guidance on what you can and can't do. And other than that, like I said, I'll have to look into that.
All right. Yeah, and I think we could probably get your contact info, and I could share the script that's actually being run, even though you don't have the database structure itself. You could at least take a look and see what's happening. Yeah. It's pretty simple, but.
Well, yeah, I could probably do a mock-up and test it out myself just to see what's going on. Cool. Yep. Yeah, and actually, speaking of so this is speaking of contact info. Again, here's the slide of what we did. This is my contact info. So by all means, reach out to me if there are questions or you want to follow up on any of this. My email address, my blog. I'm on Twitter, Mike_FAL, and again, I mentioned I'm a consultant with a company called UpSearch. Again, we do SQL Server Consulting. I do more than just PowerShell and SQL Server. I can do SQL tuning. I can do database design, availability, disaster. I do all that stuff, but PowerShell is kind of my shtick. So, but if there's something that you're like, hey, we could use some help with that, feel free to reach out with us there. And then my GitHub repo has a bunch of stuff in it, and I'm not going to claim that it's organized or even particularly useful, but that's where I put all my work in progress scripts and all the things that I've built for PowerShell and SQL Server. And you guys are more than welcome to kind of look at some of that stuff, play with some of it, see if any of it's useful. I would say that if you're doing it in your own environments, do it very far away from production and test it before you do, you use it out in your places. Mostly because I don't have a whole lot of money, so don't come trying to sue me if you use something. But other than that, you're more than welcome to play around with them and see if they're of any use to you. That's it for me. If there are any other questions, happy to answer them. Otherwise, thanks.
Great. Hey, Mike, yeah, I do have a couple questions. Can you
Sure.
real quickly explain, I don't know if you want to touch on the DBATools.io site
Oh, okay.
that Chrissy is doing, and how that differentiates from the SQL Server module?
Okay, so
That's being worked on in tandem, one from the community, one from the SQL Server team.
yeah, so DBATools.io. So Chrissy Lemaire is a PowerShell MVP. She's in Belgium. Really cool person, doing a lot of stuff. And she developed this this tools module for doing SQL Server migrations, because she had to do a lot of SQL Server migrations and she wanted to automate it. And so she started out creating this DBATools module to do it with, and it's pretty slick. Now, one of the big differences is, and when she first started working on this was a couple years ago, at the time, SQL PS was pretty clunky, and so she didn't want to use it. She basically wrote raw SMO to do a lot of the stuff. So she basically duplicated a lot of the things that were in SQL PS because she wanted something more reliable. But that's kind of neither here nor there. What she ended up doing is creating this pretty solid community module that is now getting a lot more work done on it. There's a lot of people involved, a lot of things going on where they're adding more and more functions. Now, the big difference between what you're getting out of the SQL Server modules and what you get out of DBATools is the SQL Server module is kind of what you would normally expect out of PowerShell Cmdlets. They're discrete functions that do very specific tasks. That we talked about backup SQL database. We talked about invoke SQL CMD. We've got all these commandlets that do very specific things or get very specific objects. DBATools is more of, she likes to, I hate it that she calls it wizards, but it probably is the best description. DBATools, the idea is it's giving you functions to give you large pieces of functionality. So there's a copy SQL logins, which will allow you to copy all or only specific logins from one SQL server to another. There's some best practices. Actually, one that I wrote was, there's some rules around how you want to configure your temp DB. So you run this function, and it will just automatically configure your temp DB for you according to best practices.
So these are almost kind of like the commandlets that the SQL Server team doesn't have the bandwidth to do or isn't on their.
Kind of, but it's also it's higher level functionality. Like the SQL Server team will give you a commandlet, or they gave you a commandlet to write data to a SQL table, whereas the DBATools probably has something that records a bunch of, like I think Rob Sewell made a reports module that will actually collect a bunch of information and write those to tables on their own. So there's overlap of functionality, but there's also this idea, particularly now that the SQL tools team is doing more and more around PowerShell, that the more discrete specific pieces of working with SQL Server we're gonna leave that to the SQL tools team to develop. Whereas we want higher level pieces of functionality, large automated tasks to go in DBATools.
Fair enough. One last question. The PowerShell, SQL Server PowerShell module, is that something being worked on in GitHub where you would submit issues, or do they have a user voice?
Not yet. That is an open connect item that we have. actually Chrissy opened it up back, I think, in February or March of this year to ask them to open source the SQL Server module, but they haven't done it yet. We're hoping that that's coming.
Great. I think that's it from our end. Thanks again, Mike. Really appreciate it. Great presentation. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys, and I will let you get back to your Wednesday evening. We'll talk to you later, Eric.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.